The New Testament is full of material focused on the future hope for bodily resurrection. But what do we mean by bodily resurrection? How should we understand that? In my experience, a lot of people struggle to really wrap their minds around what the New Testament means when it talks about the resurrection of the body. So in this video, we're going to talk about 3 keys for understanding what the New Testament has to say about resurrection of the body. Before we start, take a quick minute to like this video and subscribe to the Theology Project YouTube channel. Then, after you've watched the video, leave a comment and tell me which of the 3 keys you found most helpful. If you're interested in digging even more deeply into what the New Testament has to say about hope for bodily resurrection, be sure to check out my recent book, Paul and the Resurrected Body. There's a link in the description below. So how should we understand the resurrection of the body? Key number 1, the resurrection of Jesus is the prototype for the resurrection of believers. If we want to understand future hope for resurrection, we need to think about Jesus' own resurrection. And the way we need to think about that is in terms of both continuity and discontinuity. His body before his death and his body after his resurrection. When you think about those 2 bodies, there is both continuity and there's discontinuity. His body before his death and his resurrection body have some similarities, continuity. His pre-death body and his post-resurrection body have some discontinuity, some dissimilarities. So what are the continuities? Number 1, they're both physical bodies. And the New Testament, the gospel writers are at pains to emphasize the physicality of Jesus' body. The tomb is empty on Easter morning. The same body that goes into the tomb after the crucifixion on Good Friday is the body that comes out of the tomb resurrected on Easter Sunday. Jesus doesn't get a different body. He doesn't get a new body. He gets a renewed body because it's the same body that's been resurrected. So the dead body, the body that goes into the tomb, is the body that comes out of the tomb, but it has been transformed. Another way that the New Testament emphasizes the physicality of Jesus' body comes up in Luke's account of Jesus' appearances to his disciples after his resurrection. They see Jesus and he asks them, they think he's a ghost, and he asks them for some fish for breakfast. And he says to them specifically, "Ghosts do not have flesh as you see that I have." So again, there's a strong emphasis on the resurrection of body is a physical body. It's not some sort of phantasm. It's not a ghost. It's not a figment of their imagination. They're not hallucinating. Here's a real body that eats and drinks and speaks, all of those kinds of things. In terms of discontinuity, while Jesus' new body is a physical body, you also see it seems to be able to do things that normal bodies can't do. For example, in John's Gospel, Jesus is able to go into a room that of which all the doors and windows are locked. So apparently locked doors and windows don't get in the way of Jesus' resurrection body going where it wants to go. In the Gospel of John, Jesus is not immediately recognizable. In the Gospel of Luke, on the road to Emmaus, his resurrection body is not recognized until he breaks bread and offers it to his fellow travelers. So there is this sense where there is a difference, and he can go incognito and he's not immediately recognizable. There is like something has changed, even though we have a physical body, not a different body, but a renewed body, a transformed body. The phrase transformed physicality is used at times. So we got to think about the resurrection of Jesus as the model for the resurrection of all believers in the future. And that means continuity, physical bodies, and discontinuity. There's going to be some differences. Key number 2, resurrection of the body means freedom from death and freedom from sin. The New Testament talks about this as freedom from corruption and mortality. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15 that at the resurrection, the renewed body will be immortal and incorruptible. Right? It won't decay. It won't be subject to death. It won't be subject to sin. Paul says in Romans chapter 6 that the death Jesus died, he died to sin once for all. And that's the basis for his commandment for believers to reckon themselves dead to sin. And so we need to be thinking about resurrection bodies in the future as bodies that are unable to sin and unable to die. I tell people in the church setting, like if you want to try to imagine bodily resurrection, try to imagine your physical body now with all of its ailments, all of its weaknesses, all of the temptations, the tendency to sin. Try to imagine the physical body now, but imagine it unable to sin and unable to die. Imagine how spectacular your experience of human life would be if you weren't afraid of dying, if you weren't constantly being tempted to sin. If you can start to imagine that, you can start to imagine what the future resurrection of the body will be like. Key number 3, resurrection of the body means real hope and real victory. Sometimes when Christians focus on our hope, we focus on what happens to us immediately after death. You die, you go to heaven, you go to be with Jesus, and we kind of focus on that as our hope. Interestingly, the New Testament doesn't do that quite the same way. When Paul wants to comfort those who have lost loved ones, for example, in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, 13 and following, when he wants to comfort those who have lost loved ones, he doesn't say, well, your loved one is in heaven, even though that's true. He says your loved one is going to be raised from the dead when Jesus comes, and then you'll be with them and with the Lord. So when Paul wants to do pastoral care, when he wants to talk about hope and when he wants to talk about real victory over death, he talks about resurrection of the body. If we want to talk about dying and go to heaven, that's fine, but it still is another way of talking about being dead, right? Because the person has gone off to heaven in a disembodied spiritual experience because their body's in the grave and it appears that death has won. Resurrection is about bodies coming out of graves, and it means death has been defeated. One of the ways that I try to help people imagine this frequently is by encouraging folks to think about someone they love who loved Jesus, who has died, who is with Christ, but who will be raised from the dead when Christ returns. I often think how I'd love to be walking by the cemetery where my dad is buried when Jesus comes again. See, my dad died when I was a small child, and he's in heaven with Jesus, but that's not his final hope, and that's not his final victory. When Jesus comes again, if we happen to be in that cemetery where my dad is buried, we'll see the sod begin to break. We'll see the vault in which his coffin is sealed come to pieces, and the bolts on that casket will break, and his body will rise from the grave, immortal and incorruptible, unable to die, unable to decay, unable to sin. I'll hear his voice, I'll see his face, I'll feel his touch, and together we will be with Jesus in the new creation. That's real hope, that's real victory, and that's what the New Testament means when it talks about resurrection of the body.